Okay, as promised, I told you in the previous lecture a little bit about why measurement is important. In the assigned reading, a great deal of focus is on reliability. And the reason why reliability becomes such a major focus for psychologists and researchers is because there's a tremendous number of tools to assess reliability. What we don't have is we don't have a lot of tools to assess validity. And because we don't have a lot of tools, it's extremely important to understand the logic behind what is meant by validity and the different aspects of validity. So during this second video, or part 2 for this lecture, is I want to talk about these different types just to introduce you to them so that you have an appreciation for why we differentiate validity. All right, now, in order to really understand what I'm talking about, I do want to go back to my advanced organizer. I told you early on that you'll see my advanced organizer so many times that you get really tired of it. But it is an important way to synthesize material for this course. It's important for me as far as I'm concerned. It's an easy way to recreate this and to tell a story. So the first validity that we're going to talk about is convergent validity. And the way convergent validity works is simply that if you have multiple measures and the multiple measures purport to measure the same underlying construct, their convergence, their correlation, ought to be high. Any measure that measures the same construct ought to correlate. And therefore, we consider that to be convergent validity. If I have a measure, and a measure that say measures happiness, that's my antecedent. If I'm interested in measuring happiness as my antecedent, I can't really see it because it's an internal state. But if I have these 3 measures, V1, V2, and V3, and they all purport to measure happiness, well, they ought to all correlate. And if they don't, that's a problem. So this idea, this concept of convergence or convergent validity is nothing more than the correlation. In contrast to convergent validity is that if you have 2 measures, one measure claims to measure one construct and the other claims to measure an entirely different construct, in other words, 2 independent constructs, that our 2 measures should not correlate. Now, there are a lot of examples of this, but they really ought to be 2 things in our head that really are distinct. And as long as we have this idea that there's 2 constructs that exist in this world, and they have measures constructed specifically to measure that construct, one construct, and not the other construct, then we should expect very little correlation between those 2 measures, not the 2 constructs, because we can't directly measure the constructs, but we can use those 2 measures, okay? Now, if I'm interested in measuring happiness, and I have to think, let's see, what would be distinct from happiness? It's not happiness. Maybe it's satisfaction or contentment. And if you believe that these things are truly distinct, if you had a measure that confused both of them or confounded both of them, then you would have 2 separate measures that might correlate. And so therefore, they wouldn't be discriminant. They wouldn't discriminate between happiness and contentment. And what we want is we want specificity in our measures. So if I want to measure happiness, I want to make sure that my measure is measuring happiness and not contentment. And if I'm interested in measuring some other construct and it's polluted by another construct, what will happen is other measures may actually correlate with my measure of choice. okay? And there's a good bit written about this, but most importantly, Campbell and Fisk's MTMM paper, I will post it as an optional reading along with other things. And you ought to read about this if you're really going to be interested in psychological science, because that gives you a much better understanding about convergent and discriminant validity. A second or third form of validity is criterion validity. And this is something that's really, really easy to understand, primarily because in criterion validity, most of us consider validity to be based upon some criterion. If I'm aiming for a target and I'm say shooting a bow and arrow, if the arrow hits what I purport it to hit, given certain things, then I've hit the criterion, okay? And any discrepancy between that is considered to be, if it doesn't hit it reliably, it's just error. And if it constantly hits something away from it, it's missing the criterion, but there may be bias. And oftentimes we would have a criterion that we really understood, that we really wanted to make sure. The reason why we would set up criterion validity is if there were something, a measure that we knew was a spectacular measure of, let's say, a person's cognitive workload. Suppose we have this really complicated device, takes a long time to set up, and we wanted to measure the cognitive workload. In other words, how about you listening to me ramble on about this video? And I have this device that your head goes into it, and you have to be measured, and your brain is measured, and it has all these great graphs and pretty pictures, but it's a real pain because it requires you to sit in this device or have this device readily available. Suppose I have an alternative measure, just a paper and pencil or a web form, and that would be a replacement for this fancy device. If my web form, my questionnaire on the web, correlated strongly with this fancy device, then the criterion is the fancy device, and the validity relates to how well my shortcut, my little web form or questionnaire, conforms to that fancy device. And if they're strongly correlated, that's a good thing. And that means that it has very high criterion validity. Shifting gears away from things that are about correlations is more of a qualitative judgment, and that is content validity. Things that share common content, just on the face of it, will, if you look at things and you'll say, if I really want to measure happiness, you should have items about happiness. And they shouldn't be things about sadness. You shouldn't have questions about sadness unless you believe that sadness in some way is antithetical or the opposite of happiness, and it helps you understand what happiness is. The toughest thing is construct validity. Construct validity is an amalgam of all of these different validities together. And construct validity relates back to my advanced organizer. And that is, construct validity means that these three measures, these manifest variables, accurately and adequately capture the antecedent that I care about. And the way we arrive at understanding or appreciating construct validity is through convergent validity, discriminant validity, content validity, face validity, predictive validity, all different types of validities. And only after we have checked off these things can we make a judgment, an assessment about whether these manifest variables have a reasonable estimate of the construct here, either my antecedent or my consequence, and therefore we would make a judgment called that there's adequate construct validity. So construct validity doesn't have a method, it has many methods. And construct validity simply is Do our measures capture the construct of interest? Period. And it can be operationalized poorly by any one of the validities. Okay, and so that's pretty much what I want to discuss about these different validities. Do yourself a favor and go through a lot of what we've talked about. And during class, I'm going to discuss more of the advanced organizer and give you lots of examples. Thank you.